There is a letter I wrote when I was 26 years old that I never sent. Not a week has gone by in the 53 years since that I haven't thought about it. The person that letter was written for has been gone for nearly 2 decades now. Whatever I needed to say has nowhere left to go except inside me, where it has lived all this time. I want to tell you the whole story, because I think the whole story is the only honest version. I spent too many years telling myself a partial version of this story. What I've come to understand is that the partial version was something I constructed to make the silence feel less like a choice, because it was a choice. That's the part I had to eventually stop running from. I chose not to send that letter, and I chose it again every year for 53 years. The person who paid the price for that choice was not only me. Her name was Ruth. We met in the autumn of 1966 when I was 22 years old. I had just moved to Philadelphia from a small town in central Pennsylvania called Millheim. I arrived in Philadelphia in September of that year with 2 suitcases, a typewriter, and an almost painful sense of possibility. Ruth was in my graduate cohort. She was from Baltimore, the daughter of a physician father and a mother who taught piano. She had the kind of ease and self-possession that I associated with people who had grown up in larger places. She was not beautiful in any conventional way, but she was vivid. That is the word I always come back to. She was vivid in a way that made the room feel more populated when she walked into it, more awake. We were assigned to the same seminar on Victorian literature that first semester. Within 2 sessions, I understood that she was the most interesting person I had encountered in my 22 years. Within 4, I understood that I was not simply interested in her the way you are interested in an impressive peer. I was drawn to her the way you are drawn to something that illuminates the shape of your own interior. That shows you rooms in yourself you had not previously known existed. I want to be precise about what I mean by that, because I think precision matters here. I was in love with Ruth, not in a friendship that felt like love, not in an admiration that could be mistaken for love. In love with her, fully and specifically, in the way that rearranges the furniture of your inner life, and makes everything you looked at before appear slightly shifted. This was 1966. I want you to hold on to that year as I tell you the rest of this, because the year is not incidental. The year is structural. It shaped everything that followed in ways that were not accidental, and that I could not, at the time, have simply chosen my way around. Ruth and I became close quickly, in the way that people become close when they are young and living away from home for the first time, surrounded by ideas that feel urgent and a future that feels genuinely open. We studied together, argued about books, walked through the city on weekend afternoons, talking about things that felt enormous to us at 22. Faulkner and Woolf, and what literature was actually for, and whether the domestic and the cosmic were in opposition or secretly the same subject. We made each other laugh in that particular way, where the laughter comes from a shared perception of something that most people around you don't seem to see. That kind of shared laughter, when you are young and searching, feels like recognition, like proof that you are not, after all, alone inside your own mind. I told myself that what I felt for Ruth was friendship, an extraordinary friendship. It's just friendship? The truth of what I actually felt was something I had no framework for and no courage to approach directly. In 1966, what I felt for Ruth was not something I had language for, that didn't also feel like a diagnosis or a moral failure. So I put it in a drawer inside myself and called it friendship and moved forward. We were inseparable for 2 years, through the end of our coursework, through the beginning of our dissertations, through the various upheavals of 1968, which arrived into all of our lives like weather none of us had quite prepared for. We marched together in protests. We sat up too late in her small apartment on Spruce Street, having arguments that became conversations, that became the kind of silence that is actually a form of communication. I knew the sound of her laugh from across a crowded room. I knew she took her coffee with too much sugar. She reread the same 3 pages of Middlemarch every time she was anxious, and that she cried at small, unexpected things. In the spring of 1968, a man named Thomas entered Ruth's life. He was a law student at Penn, serious and principled and kind. The kind of man who listens when you talk and means it, and Ruth fell in love with him in the straightforward, uncomplicated way. I was, God help me, jealous of in ways I could barely acknowledge to myself. Not jealous of him exactly. Jealous of the simplicity of what they had. The way it required no translation, no careful management of language. They were in love and everyone could see it, and no one required them to pretend it was something else. I told myself I was glad for her. And I was glad for her, genuinely, because I loved her and I wanted her to be happy. But underneath the genuine gladness was something I was less willing to examine, a grief that had no legitimate name. A loss of something I had never technically had, but had been, I understood now, living inside the possibility of. I finished my dissertation in 1969 and accepted a teaching position at a small college in western Massachusetts. Ruth and Thomas were engaged by then, planning a June wedding. When I left Philadelphia that summer, there was a conversation between us that I have replayed so many times. I can no longer be entirely sure which parts are memory and which parts are reconstruction. We said we would write, and we did write, for years, long letters, the kind of letters that people don't write anymore, full of real thought and real feeling, carefully composed and saved in shoeboxes that I still have somewhere in the back of my closet. I know we embraced at the door of her apartment, and I know I walked down the stairs and out onto Spruce Street. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment before I started walking, and I know that what I felt on that sidewalk was the particular weight of something ending, something that I had never allowed to begin. I settled into my life in Massachusetts. I taught literature to undergraduates, published some essays, built a small but genuine reputation in my field, had relationships with men that were real and sometimes warm and that I cared about in the ways I was capable of caring about them, with a reservation at the center of myself that I had learned to work around without fully understanding what it was. I visited Ruth and Thomas in Philadelphia twice in the early 70s. They had a daughter by then, a girl named Clara. Their home was warm and full of books and argument, and the kind of comfortable clutter that indicates a life being actively lived in. Thomas was good. I want to say that clearly. He was good to her and for her, and I could see that. It did not diminish my feeling for Ruth. It simply clarified it into something I understood I would carry quietly for as long as I needed to carry it. In the winter of 1972, I sat down and wrote the letter. I don't remember exactly what prompted it. I had been reading a novel, I think, something that had cracked something open in me that I usually kept more carefully closed. I was alone in my apartment on a Sunday evening in December, and I simply began to write to Ruth the way I had never permitted myself to write to her. Honestly, without the protective layer of careful friendship language, saying the things I had never said and explaining, as clearly as I could manage, what the last 6 years of my life had actually contained. I wrote for 2 hours. When I finished, I read it back and I understood that it was true in a way that almost nothing I had written in my professional life had been true, because it cost me something to write it, which is the only real test of truth in writing and possibly in everything else. It was 12 pages long. I folded it and put it in an envelope and addressed the envelope to Ruth at the Philadelphia address. I had memorized so completely it was like a reflex, and then I put the envelope on my kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. And then I put it in a drawer. I told myself I was protecting her, which was true in the smallest and most convenient sense of the word. I told myself that sending the letter would place a burden on her that she hadn't asked for and didn't deserve, that it would complicate or damage a marriage that was making her happy, that my need to be known was less important than her peace and her stability. These were not entirely false reasons. They contained enough truth to be functional. But they were not the whole truth, and I think I knew that even then, though I was better at not looking directly at things I knew than I became later. The whole truth was that I was afraid. Afraid of what she would think of me. Afraid of what saying it out loud, even in a letter, would do to the version of myself I had constructed. Afraid that she would be kind about it in a way that would feel worse than any other response. Afraid that naming the thing would make it more real, more fixed, more undeniable. Keeping it unspoken allowed me to maintain ambiguity, a space where nothing was fully confirmed. So the letter stayed in the drawer. Weeks passed, then months, and then somehow years. Ruth and I continued to write our careful, affectionate, edited letters to each other. I moved the unfinished letter from apartment to apartment, keeping it without being entirely sure why. Maybe because throwing it away would have felt like a different kind of loss than leaving it unread. Ruth and Thomas had a second child in 1975, a boy they named James. Ruth got her own teaching position at Penn in 1978 and became a respected scholar. Her field was Victorian women's writing, which pleased me enormously. It was the field I had originally imagined for myself before my interests shifted. We fell into the rhythm of people who care about each other across a distance. The birthday calls, the Christmas letters, the occasional visit. It always felt both completely natural and slightly managed on my side, like a performance. I was careful to be only what I was permitted to be. Her friend, her old friend, the one who remembered things about her that Thomas didn't know because he hadn't been there. I was careful and consistent, good at being precisely the person the situation required. But there are limits to how long you can be careful, moments when carefulness fails. One of those moments came in 1989. I was 45, Ruth was 46. She called to tell me Thomas had a serious heart condition, prognosis uncertain. I listened to her voice, steady in the way people's voices are when working hard to be steady. I felt two things simultaneously that I have never fully forgiven myself for feeling. The first was genuine fear and grief for her, the clean and uncomplicated love. The second, underneath it, much smaller but present, impossible to pretend wasn't there. Evidence of the complex, inconsistent interior life that human beings have. Thomas recovered. The intervention worked. Recovery was slow but real. By 1991, he was largely himself again, though changed in ways serious illness changes people. Ruth told me the experience had made them closer, stripped away things, left something essential. I was genuinely glad for that. I want to be clear about that. I was genuinely glad. My mother died in 1993, a loss that took longer to process than I expected. Partly because my mother and I had a complicated relationship, partly because grief opens old wounds. Ruth came to the funeral, which I hadn't asked her to do, and which moved me. She didn't try to fill the silence, and that was exactly the right thing. That knowledge, that she understood what I needed, was both a comfort and another ache. I retired from teaching in 2008, after nearly 40 years in the classroom. I settled into a quieter, more interior life. I wrote more. I read more. I spent more time with the question of what my life had actually been and what it had meant. I thought about Ruth during that period with a frequency and frankness I had not permitted. The business of daily professional life, a reliable distraction, was no longer there. I called her more often during those years. We had long conversations, full of the same quality of mutual recognition that had always characterized our friendship. She told me I was one of the few people who had known her before she knew who she was. Something irreplaceable about being known in the early form of yourself. Ruth's health began to decline in 2013. It started as manageable, but it progressed, and by 2015, it was clear what she was dealing with was serious. I visited Philadelphia twice that year. The second time, in November, I stayed for 4 days. We spent most of those days talking, the way you talk when conversations are finite. She was thinner, slower, but still herself. Still Ruth. Still the most interesting person. We talked about everything except the thing I had never said, which sat in the room with us. On the last afternoon, in her living room, the light made everything look amber and fragile. I understood I might not see her again, or it would be different, more managed. I thought about the letter in the drawer, whether this was the moment to say the things. And I didn't. I told myself I was protecting her, that this was not the moment to add something complicated. What she needed was the friend she always had, not the version of me stored in a drawer. These reasons were not entirely false, but again, not the whole truth. The whole truth was the same. I was afraid. Afraid it was too late. Afraid that changing our relationship, even privately, would feel like a violation. Afraid she would look at me and not know what to do, undoing 50 years. I left Philadelphia on a gray November morning. I hugged her at the door. I told her I loved her, which was true and which she said back. Both of us understood it in the way old friends understand it, not the way I meant it. I cried for most of the first hour, not for what I was losing, but for what I had never allowed to exist. Ruth died in April of 2016. Her daughter Clara called me. I said the things you say when you receive news like that, true and inadequate. I went to the funeral. I sat in the church and looked at the photographs of her life. The young Ruth, the Philadelphia Ruth, the Professor Ruth, the grandmother Ruth, all those versions of a person who had been so vivid, even the photographs had energy. And I thought about the letter in the drawer. I thought about it very specifically. I had written it when I was 26. Ruth had lived her whole life without knowing it existed, and she had died without knowing. What was in that letter, the real and specific truth, had never had anywhere to go, except back into me, where it had been circling for 50 years, like a bird that can't find a place to land. The whole truth was that I was afraid. Afraid of what she would think of me. Afraid of what saying it out loud, even in a letter, would do to the version of myself I had constructed. Afraid that she would be kind or not kind. Afraid that naming it would make it too real, too fixed. Keeping it unspoken allowed ambiguity, a space where nothing was fully confirmed, beyond revision. So the letter stayed in the drawer. Weeks, months, then years passed. Ruth and I wrote careful, affectionate letters. I moved the unfinished letter from apartment to apartment, keeping it, not sure why. Throwing it away would have felt like a different kind of loss. Ruth and Thomas had a second child, James, in 1975. Ruth got a teaching position at Penn in 1978. She became a respected scholar in Victorian women's writing, which pleased me enormously. Also, with a small pang, because it was the field I had imagined for myself before my interests shifted. We fell into a rhythm of people who care across a distance. Birthday calls, Christmas letters, occasional visits. These visits felt natural yet managed, a performance of friendship that was both real and constructed. I was careful to be only what I was permitted. Her friend, her old friend from Philadelphia. The one who remembered things Thomas didn't know. I was careful, consistent, and good at it. But there are limits to how long you can be careful, or moments when carefulness fails. One such moment came in 1989. I was 45, Ruth 46. She called to say Thomas had a serious heart condition, prognosis uncertain. I heard her steady voice, working hard to be steady. I felt two things simultaneously. First, genuine fear and grief for her, the clean love of someone who doesn't want them to suffer. Second, underneath it, much smaller but present, something I will not name here. The first feeling was in charge. The second was evidence of a complex, inconsistent interior life. Thomas recovered. The intervention worked. Recovery was slow but real. By 1991, he was himself again. Ruth told me the experience made them closer, stripping away habits, leaving something essential. I was genuinely glad for that. I want to be clear about that. I was genuinely glad. The years continued. My mother died in 1993, a loss that took longer to process. Partly because our relationship was complicated, partly because grief opens old wounds. Ruth came to the funeral, which moved me more than I knew how to say. She didn't try to fill the silence, and that was exactly the right thing. That knowledge, that she understood what I needed, was both comfort and familiar ache. I retired from teaching in 2008, after nearly 40 years. My life became quieter, more interior. I wrote more, read more. I spent more time with the question of what my life had been. I thought about Ruth with a frequency and frankness I hadn't permitted for a long time. Not because anything had changed, but because daily professional life was no longer a distraction. I called her more often. We had long conversations, like in Philadelphia, full of mutual recognition. She said I was one of few who knew her before she knew herself, irreplaceable. Being known in your early form by someone who watched the later forms develop. I wrote that sentence down. Ruth's health began to decline in 2013. It started manageable, but progressed. By 2015, it was clear it was serious, changing everything. I visited Philadelphia twice. The second time, in November, I stayed 4 days. We spent most of those days talking. Talking the way you talk when you understand the number of conversations remaining is finite. She was thinner, slower, but still herself. Still Ruth. Still the most interesting person. We talked about everything except the thing I had never said, which sat in the room with us. Taking up air without being acknowledged, the way unspoken things always do. On the last afternoon, in her living room, light coming in at a low November angle. Everything looked slightly amber and fragile. I understood I might not see her again. I thought about the letter, not thrown away in 43 years. Was this the moment to say it? To say the things the letter said out loud, without paper and ink, just between us. And I didn't. I told myself I was protecting her. This was not the moment to add something complicated. What she needed was the friend she always had, not the version of me stored in a drawer. These reasons were not entirely false, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was the same. I was afraid. Afraid it was too late, that the timing was wrong, that our relationship was set. Changing it, even privately, would feel like a violation of something we had both agreed to. Afraid she would look at me and not know what to do, undoing something I kept intact. I left Philadelphia on a gray November morning. I hugged her at the door. I told her I loved her, which was true, and she said it back. We understood it as old friends. Not the way I meant it. I got in my car and drove north, crying for the first hour. Not for what I was losing, but for what I had never allowed to exist in a form that could be lost. Ruth died in April of 2016. Her daughter Clara called me that morning. I heard the news and said the things you say, true and inadequate. I went to the funeral. I looked at photographs of her life near the entrance. Young Ruth, Philadelphia Ruth, Professor Ruth, Grandmother Ruth, all vivid. Even the photographs had energy. And I thought about the letter in the drawer. I thought about it very specifically. I wrote it when I was 26, Ruth 27. She lived her whole life without knowing it existed, and died without knowing it existed. What was in that letter, the truth of what I felt, had never had anywhere to go, except back into me, circling for 50 years like a bird that can't find a place to land.